Thank you so much. I love that love coming my way. I'm going to be talking about education in a very different setting today. I'm here to talk to you about my personal experiences working with the Tibetan refugee community of Dharamsala in northern India. And I'm not sure how to get my slides. A moment. I'm not sure. We'll see. I went to India to be a teacher, but I very quickly realized that, in fact, I was the student. I learned in India that there's no telling where our own compassion can take us if we'll only open ourselves up to the experience and to get outside of our comfort zone and take some risks. I also learned that there's no telling what we can learn about the nature of compassion from the people around us if we're just willing to open ourselves up to the message. And my own education in compassion took me from my home in Manchester, New Hampshire, up into the foothills of the Himalayas, where I learned absolutely incredible lessons about the nature of compassion, community, strength, and resilience from my amazing Tibetan students, who were, in fact, the true teachers. And I'm not sure how to... I'm sorry, I'm not sure technologically what to do here. Dharamsala, India, where I actually had this absolutely transformative experience, is in northern India. It is the home of His Holiness the Dalai Lama of Tibet. It is the seat of the Tibetan government in exile. And it is the center of an incredibly rich and vibrant Tibetan exile community. Now there we go, it's working. This is Dharamsala. To understand why the Tibetans are exiles in from their homeland of Tibet, why they're in India, it helps to know a little bit about Tibetan history. So I'm going to step outside of my own personal experience for just a moment and give you a little bit of that history to situate you in my personal experience. Tibet is a huge country. It's about the size of Western Europe. It's located on a plateau in the Himalayas, the Tibetan plateau, between China and India. It is, for many years, it was an independent country. It was led by the Dalai Lamas, a line of reincarnated leaders who returned lifetime after lifetime to guide their people. That takes a little bit of explaining. In Tibetan Buddhism, there is a belief that we are all of us on a path toward enlightenment. It's a path that takes us many lifetimes. In the meantime, we are trapped in a cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth that's known as samsara, until we attain enlightenment, when we can enter into nirvana. Certain beings, once they have left samsara, attained enlightenment, they're able to enter into nirvana. But because they feel so much compassion for those of us who are still here trapped in samsara, they choose to come back into this cycle of suffering again and again to lead those of us who are still here on the path to enlightenment. These beings are known as the Bodhisattvas. And technological difficulties here. Sorry, can everyone hear me? Is that okay? I'm sorry about that. I think I might have to hold this up here. This is the Bodhisattva vow, and to me it's the perfect expression of the compassion of the Bodhisattva. As long as space remains, as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain and dispel the mysteries of the world. Tibetans believe that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is the Bodhisattva of compassion who returns lifetime after lifetime to lead them. He is the human embodiment of compassion. He is an incredibly sacred being to the Tibetan people, so important for their culture and for their religion. The current Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, was born in a farming village in Tibet, in Amdo in far eastern Tibet. At the age of 2, he was discovered to be the reincarnation of his predecessor, the 13th Dalai Lama. At the age of 5, he was enthroned as the spiritual leader of Tibet in Lhasa. When he was 15 years old, he and his nation faced an incredible crisis when Tibet was invaded by the forces of the People's Republic of China. At the age of 16, the age of many of the people here in this audience, if you're still in high school, he took on full political leadership of Tibet and began to negotiate on behalf of his people for the future of his nation and of his entire culture. And it was at that time that he realized that he had to face the aggression of the invasion with a nonviolent response. And that's a response that he maintains until this day, and that's part of the Tibet movement today as well. When the Dalai Lama was 24 years old, there was a popular uprising in Tibet against Chinese rule. And the Chinese forces really responded to it with brutality. His Holiness was forced into exile. He had to leave. He had to leave Tibet for his life. He went over the Himalayas, a journey that took a month, so that he could get into exile in India, where he was welcomed by the new Indian government and was allowed to establish a Tibetan government in exile here in Dharamsala, in the foothills of the Himalayas. He was followed by thousands and thousands of his own people, refugees who left everything behind them in Tibet to get into freedom in exile in India and to try to reestablish their culture and their society in exile. Once in India, the Tibetans began rebuilding the monasteries that had been destroyed by the Chinese forces. They built schools, which are now known as the Tibetan Children's Village Schools, a system of schools that educate Tibetan children in exile all the way from kindergarten through high school. They set up hospitals, social service organizations. They did everything they could to try to preserve the culture that was being destroyed in their homeland in Tibet. And today, there are still refugees who come every year, young men and women who leave everything behind them in Tibet, their family, their friends, their possessions, to take that incredibly arduous trip over the mountains to get to India so that they can be near His Holiness and so they can practice the very rights and freedoms that we ourselves take for granted, like freedom of speech, freedom to practice their religion, freedom to be educated in their own culture. Because in Tibet, in their own villages, oftentimes they can't get educated at all. The fees are too expensive. And if they do go to a school, the instruction takes place in Chinese, and it's a Chinese education rather than a Tibetan education. So, how did this librarian from Manchester, New Hampshire end up in the foothills of the Himalayas teaching English to Tibetan refugees? At some point in the early 90s, I read an article, and I knew a little bit about, I knew who the Dalai Lama was, I knew a little bit about Tibet, but I read an article that just really hit me very deeply about the Dalai Lama and about the situation in Tibet. And I was fascinated and I was galvanized. I was fascinated to learn more. I'm a librarian. I went to work in my library and took out all the books that we had on the Dalai Lama, on Tibetan history, and decided to educate myself. But I also felt really driven to action. So I found this organization, the Monadnock Friends of Tibet, a local support group that at the time was active in the Keene, New Hampshire area. I got involved with them. I helped organize events to raise awareness about the Tibetan situation. And while with the MFT, I met people who had actually gone to India themselves to work firsthand with the refugees and to immerse themselves in Tibetan culture. I met people who led student groups over for service learning experiences. I met a woman who led a school sponsorship program for children in a kindergarten in Dharamsala, and it became my own personal dream to travel to India if I could only find the time to make it worthwhile and to work with the Tibetans myself. Well, in 2007, I finally got the opportunity. I was able to take, one good thing about being an academic is that you get a sabbatical every so often. It's one good thing about it. There are many. But in 2007, I was able to take 6 months away from my position at UNH Manchester to work on a personal project. And I got the approval to go to Dharamsala and to teach English. I found this organization called La Charitable Trust, LHA. La is actually a Tibetan word that means goddess. It is also an acronym for the Louisiana Himalaya Association. It's an, who'd have thought? It's an organization connected to Tulane University. I got in touch with them, and it was my first introduction to life in India. They just sort of said, sure, come on over. We'll find something for you to do. And I thought, how do I write that into a proposal? But, but I did. I got the approval, and in July 2007, I boarded a plane for Delhi. arrived, and then took the 13-hour bus ride up through the mountains overnight to Dharamsala. I arrived in India just in time for the monsoon season. Just in time. It was like clockwork. Monsoon, if you don't know, is 3 hours of absolutely torrential downpours daily. Nothing gets dry. Your clothing is wet. Your bedding is wet. It's also known as a time that breeds a lot of sickness. And inevitably, I got sick. I got physically sick. I got homesick. I had culture shock. And I oftentimes wondered if I was actually up to the task, if I could really take this for 6 months. I had a lot of self-doubt. But what I started to learn was to look, and I don't know if you can see it there, I began to look for the rainbow in the clouds. I began to look for the beauty in everyday life in Dharamsala. I began to appreciate those moments that shone through all of the difficult times. For example, I learned to relish the sound of the chanting of the nuns in the nunnery across from my guest house, a sound that woke me up every single morning. I began to cherish the view of the sunset on the mountains over Dharamsala, that sunset over the Himalayas. And it was a sight that was particularly beautiful when it had been raining all day. And finally at sunset, the sun broke out. I began to cherish the time I spent with my friends, my fellow volunteers, people who had come from all over the world like me and shared my own passion to help the Tibetan people. And I began to see these moments of beauty and to start looking through the difficult times and at that beauty because of the example of my Tibetan students. These were young people, as I said, who had left everything behind, family, friends, possessions, and arrived with nothing in a strange country. And yet, they always faced everything with such amazing good cheer and such warmth. And they always had time to smile and say hello. If they could do it, why couldn't I? The students that I taught were, for the most part, recent refugees. They're called the newcomers, who had not necessarily benefited from the education of the TCB schools. Organizations like LHA, volunteer organizations, are set up to help these newcomers acclimate to life in exile and hopefully to get some skills that they need so that they can find work in India or wherever else they might go in the Tibetan diaspora. So LHA offered a soup kitchen, it had a library, a health clinic, as well as language classes, computer classes, massage therapy classes, anything that could give the students a skill. I was there to teach English. At LHA, I taught my students in one room with no desks, just cushions for my students on the floor, and I was standing in front of them. I had a whiteboard behind me that sometimes had markers that worked. In fact, sometimes the beginning of class was my sending someone, could you go down to the office and see if there are ever any markers, and usually there weren't. There was no set curriculum. Students would come and go. Sometimes a student would come, be there for a month, then disappear for a month because he had to go help family or had to work, and then would come back having missed everything I had taught in the meantime. I did grammar drills, we learned vocab together, we read. While I was teaching, it was frequently there would be a monsoon downpour and the rain and the hail would be clattering on the roof and I'd be shouting to be heard. And even when the rain stopped, the school was right over the main marketplace of the town, so there'd be the sound coming up from the marketplace of cowbells going through and music from the many CD stands where people were selling Tibetan music to the tourists and the sound of vendors selling their wares. It was very difficult. It was very trying. It wasn't an ideal situation, I suppose, in which to teach, and yet somehow I did teach. I have to say that my students learned. I saw them make progress with English. That was wonderful. But I came to realize that the real education was happening not necessarily in my classroom, but in the conversation classes that I participated in after the classroom experience. At LHA and at another school that I found in the town, the Tibet Hope Center, in the afternoons they would offer conversation classes for the Tibetans to be able to come, get matched with some English language volunteers so that they could practice their skills in speaking English. They could practice in a real dialogue. And it was in those classes that I learned. That's where I learned certain things like the rules of cricket from a sports-crazy young monk who was so excited to learn about baseball from me. That's where I learned about the wonderful, wonderful days that my students had spent at home in Tibet, in their nomad or farming villages, sleeping under the stars with their family and their friends. It was in the conversation classes that I learned of their yearning in exile for those families and friends and for those Tibetan skies. It was in conversation class that I learned of their incredible devotion for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, a devotion that in Tibet actually led them to take actions that could have gotten them arrested and even tortured. Some of my students told stories about their family having to go to their home altars, an altar that might be similar to this, and hide the photographs of the Dalai Lama that were on that altar because Chinese police were coming door to door. And in Tibet, it's illegal to even own a photograph of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. From my students, I learned of their incredible bravery, what a risk they took coming over the mountains. They told me of friends they had who had lost fingers or even limbs to frostbite on that trip. I learned of people they knew of who never made it, who were arrested on the route or who died in the snows of the Himalayas. I came to stand in awe of their generosity and the fact that a people who could come to this country and have so little were so willing to share what they had with each other. Whenever one of their number fell on hard times, became sick and couldn't work, had trouble taking care of her children, they came together as a community, and they actually were willing to help and give what little they had. I came to be absolutely humbled by, their gratitude toward we, their teachers, the volunteers who had come to help them. That they would look at me and be thankful for what little I gave when I realized that they were the ones who were giving me something. They were always full of good cheer, no matter what happened. I can remember walking into class, having been caught up in a monsoon rainstorm, soaking wet and really grumpy, and walking into class, and there were my students on their cushions, and they were wet as well, but they smiled. They were happy. Hello, teacher, ready to learn. So thankful, and yet they were the ones who were warming my heart. They were the ones who were willing to share a cup of tea, to share a bowl of hot Tibetan soup on a rainy day when I knew that they had trouble even finding that meal. What I came to realize was that Tibetan culture thrives and survives in exile because it is steeped in the concept of community and in the concept of compassion. You see, the Tibetans believe they truly, truly teach that happiness doesn't depend upon succeeding in some race. It doesn't depend upon getting the most possessions. We are happy when we are compassionate. We are happy when our communities are compassionate. We are happy when we reach out to other people, even through our own difficulty, and share. That's what creates a happy society. And this is a motto that it's a photograph I took. This is on the wall of one of the Tibetan children's village schools in India. It's a Tibetan children's village motto. It says, "Others before self." And I think it perfectly expresses the spirit of compassion that is a part of Tibetan society. And I was just amazed to think of these students who are being educated with this as their motto and this is their touchstone. I was awed by it. What I came to realize was that I had actually gone to India for the education. My students were in exile, yes, but I was in exile too, and the education was mine. Through them, I learned that we are compassionate when we, even in the midst of our own difficulties, find the room to reach out to other people and to help them and to be kind to them. I realized that we as a society are compassionate when we are able to create communities that offer that level of support and that level of compassion. My life has changed a lot since I was in India 5 years ago. For one thing, I met my husband Darji, who's with us today, while I was in India. And he just became a US citizen actually 2 weeks ago. So thank you, Darji. And our son, Tenzin, that's our little guy. He bears the name of my personal hero, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gamtso. Let me see. I think of my Tibetan students so often. I think of my Tibetan students when I find that whatever difficulty I might find myself in gets in the way of my ability to look at the people around me and to respond to them with compassion. I always try to think of those Tibetan students who suffered so much and yet were willing to give so much and willing to share so much. And just on a final note, the situation, I sort of brought you up to speed with my life 5 years later, but 5 years later, the situation in Tibet is particularly dire. In 2008, there were protests all over Tibet against Chinese rule, calling for the return of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Since then, there has been a crackdown in Tibet. And in the past 2 years, 50 young men and women, people who, when I see their faces online, remind me of the students that I taught when I was in India. 50 people have taken the ultimate sacrifice, what the Tibetans view as the ultimate act of nonviolent protest, by taking their own lives through acts of self-immolation. To the Tibetans, this is seen as an act of compassion because they are giving up themselves for the good of the entire society to try to bring the world's attention to what's happening in Tibet. I personally believe that the Tibetans have so much to teach the world. Their culture has so much to teach the world about the nature of compassion. And I also think it's the world's tragedy that that culture is threatened right now. So as a final note, I ask you to remember the compassion of the Tibetan people and also to remember them with compassion as well. So, thank you.